Hi everyone, Elvina from Arcadier here. Today on Inspire, we have Georgia Beattie. Georgia joins us today with a diverse leadership background. She started off as an entrepreneur herself, as founder and CEO of Lupe Wines. Then she moved to nonprofit, Startup Victoria as CEO, and now she's executive manager at Spacely, an online marketplace for short-term and shared working spaces around Australia. Hi Georgia, thank you for joining us today. How are you?
I'm excellent. Thank you so much for having me.
Our pleasure. So maybe you can just start off by telling everybody a little bit about yourself and, just your background and experiences since they are quite interesting.
Depends what lens you put on it with interesting. It's definitely not sort of a planned career path, but I'll give you some background on my adventure to date. So I actually studied. So I'm in Melbourne, but I studied over in Boston and studied entrepreneurship. And straight out of school, I decided to start a manufacturing business of all things. And it came out, I was actually at a Melbourne music festival and they wouldn't serve me a glass of wine because it was too hard to serve outdoors. So I decided that I'd go and make my own single serve glass of wine so that it could be served outdoors. Classic sort of uni student solution to a problem and being an alcohol business. And so I actually, out of whether it was ignorance or just stupidity, just launched this business. So I put together a prototype and was able to raise some seed capital and set up a manufacturing line here in Melbourne. And so I have a wine background. My family's in wine. So I understood that side of it, the manufacturing and then the sort of scaling a startup and raising capital and going through all of those sort of adventures, the ups and downs of startup was completely unknown. So so that was the sort of beginning of my of my learnings, and I scaled that business quite quickly. So we launched in Australia, but we went into Asia very quickly, and I exited that business in early 2016, and which took me to run Startup Victoria. And to be honest, I was living on a plane for the last few years of running Lupe Wines. So Startup Victoria for me was a bit of I guess it was a recalibration. It was a time for me to give back to the community because as a founder, you're so reliant on the startup community for learnings because you go through, as you're growing and you're growing so quickly. Whether you're sort of starting your business, it's all about ideation and finding employees through to raising capital and then going overseas and then scaling your business overseas and how all that works. So you end up sort of burrowing in your business and coming back out into the startup ecosystem to go and learn more. So that was a really lovely time for me to go and lead the ecosystem here in Melbourne and really give back to the community while I decided what I wanted to do with my life after I had sold my business. So it was a very daunting period, but at the same time, incredibly rewarding. And so then I did that for 2 years. And now I've jumped back onto the tools and I'm working with one of Australia's original startups. It's now a 25-year-old, $10 billion publicly listed company, but they're looking at doing these high growth ventures so that they're sort of picking the next sort of trends that are happening globally in the real estate space. So I'm running one of their high growth ventures called Spacely.
Very nice. So I guess just on the topic of, all these different industries, you being part of the startup community, then giving back to it. I know Startup Victoria is a nonprofit, and obviously your wine startup was not, and then now working for, a former startup that is now a billion-dollar company. What are some of the key differences you see and key commonalities as well? When you were working in these different kind of corporate structures, and what's some advice you would give to people? Because right now I know that our listeners are probably all over the board with their work life and their experiences and what they're kind of dealing with, and a lot of them might be grappling with the idea of becoming an entrepreneur. What are some differences and commonalities you would see in those?
I've seen all of these sort of three different industries for the first time. So I have got a certain perspective on it. And this is my first time in a big business and in a corporate. So, I mean, the biggest, you can basically have a startup attitude with anything that you do. And the biggest difference for me working, being in a startup to sort of a big corporate is being exclusive versus inclusive. And so in a startup, you really have to be very focused and have almost an exclusive mentality. And that for me was who I surrounded myself by, who my friends were. I needed like-minded people to, so that when I was sort of going through challenges or catching up for downtime or whatever, that it was a specific sort of type of I guess, person that was in a similar space to me. So we had sort of similarities there. And it's the same thing with as you're expanding your business, people that are sort of going down similar paths, because you've only got sort of limited time and you need incredible focus versus it's more of an inclusive mentality within a corporate, and you've got lots of stakeholders you actually need to bring on the journey with this venture. So the difference is, I guess, they're two different ecosystems. So a startup is in startup ecosystem within Melbourne and then within Australia, and then sort of and then there's sort of a broader Asian ecosystem, which Australia is part of. But you're sort of a solo, and then you've got to sort of go in and out where you see fit, and where and really suss out where you need to be, sort of the right time at the right place. Where I'm now navigating the ecosystem within realestate.com. And so, the REA Group's got, lots of ventures that expand internationally, but the bigger businesses here in Australia. So we've got all these stakeholders here, but also I've got lots of assets that I can leverage as a high growth venture, and within the group. And so that's sort of, working out how to navigate those. So the biggest difference is the ecosystem and I guess finding who the key stakeholders are and how you move things quickly. Because regardless of where you are, what you want is fast feedback loops, so that you are making, it's not sort of, it's sort of, the premise is that fail fast mentality, but it's also just making sure you're on track. And the only way you can make sure you're on track is if you're sort of being very data driven.
That's so interesting. I feel like that we keep on hearing from multiple speakers and founders that the ecosystem in startups it's so important, especially whether it comes to finding partners or co-founders, or when, like you said, just making sure that you have like-minded people, because it is a very lonely, intense journey, and it's very important to have that kind of support system. Not everyone necessarily gets it and kind of think that you're crazy.
Most of the time they think you're crazy, yeah. And you also can't necessarily afford the advice that you might need. But even if you do go to experts, a lot of the time you're doing something that's so new that even if they are the sort of the best M&A lawyer in a certain area, they may not have dealt in your area. So they're also learning on the job as well. And I found that to be the case a lot of the time. And so what you can do is find similarities in other businesses, even though they might be completely different, but they're like fundamentally solving a similar problem, and you can learn from their experience and how they sort of mapped that landscape. And I guess that's the thing with technology moving so quickly. There's not a rule book for this stuff anymore.
Yeah, very, very true. That's actually a very good point, is that like everything is kind of uncharted waters at this point. So you kind of just have to pull from different resources and kind of, see where some similarities are, even though it might seem completely different and a little crazy. So on that, and you finding your different ecosystems and kind of support systems and communities, what advice would you give to starting like aspiring entrepreneurs, and how can they reach out to different communities within their own sphere?
There's lots of different stages. You've got like the aspirational entrepreneur that's got a job, but they they can see something that the change that they want to see in the world, whether it's in a particular business or industry, and they're looking at diving into that versus the scale up, which is really starting to get traction. And then there's sort of the later stage companies. And so each of those stages have got actually require a different ecosystem to be around them, and they're solving different problems. But say, I mean, I love that early stage, and I encourage everyone I meet to go and to try and start a business and create this minimal viable product to actually go and test. So for the aspirational entrepreneurs, entrepreneurship is a fantastic thing because you can go and be the change you want to see in the world. And so rather than saying, I wish it was like this, you can actually go and put something together and just test it. And you'll be amazed at the response you get when you actually put yourself out there. And create something, and then go and pitch it to whether it's your manager or a CEO in another company, and say, this is a product or service that I've created. Get a little bit of data behind it. Go and test it. Go and sell it. You see lots of entrepreneurs that it's like they've had this idea that they've been sitting on for a while. It's like their child, and they don't want to put it out in the open because they're worried what people will think, or that someone will steal it, or whatever it is. But the best thing you can do is get your idea out there and get some data behind it. So go and sell it to a stranger and listen to what they say, because that will then sort of, you'll go back to the drawing board and think, actually, this product or service needs to change slightly, or that price point's not right. Whatever it is, but that'll sort of, the more you do that, and you can do that while you're working, you're then able to really refine and work out very quickly what your, I guess what the problem is that you're solving, and I guess what the landscape looks like. You want to be in love with the problem, not in love with your solution. That's my sort of biggest, I guess, advice for those aspirational entrepreneurs, that it's very easy to fall in love with your solution, and you actually need to really focus on the problem and be flexible with what the solution looks like.
That's excellent advice. Definitely very true. That sometimes you just get so laser focused on what you're doing, and you don't really necessarily see the bigger problem at hand, and that you always had to keep that end goal in mind, which is the problem, not necessarily your product or solution. You've been working with remote teams. So what are some of the biggest challenges you faced with dealing with remote teams and working, thousands of miles away from your equivalent in Japan, for example?
Yeah, I mean, look, realestate.com here do an incredible job with making sure, because they've got teams in Xi'an in China. And I mean, I could take you for a walk around the office now and show you these screens that they've got at the end of the row of hot desks. And you've got on the other side the same row of desks in Xi'an. And so you can just go up at any hour of the day and have a chat to someone there. And so it's a live feed. And so I found even just simple things like office jokes or disasters that happened in market that we can all laugh about and support each other on. Although we were using things like Slack, it was still, because it wasn't sort of live, it's hard to translate that culture over, I guess. And so and I've been really impressed with realestate.com here is having that efficiency for communication regardless of where you are. So but Slack, and it's funny, even just we found taking photos of certain things was a great way to communicate sort of where people are and what they were doing and what their environment was like. So that, I mean, that was the biggest thing for me in sort of having these dispersed teams. At the end of the day, although there were market differences, they're still selling the same product. And so having a channel like Slack to be able to upload photos and say, hey, this person said this, and then we could have someone that would pipe in, in Taiwan and say, oh, I solved that problem last week, you're doing this. And so that was on sort of on the sales side of things, that they were very quickly able to share. And sharing's it's the trust thing, which is really important, but also it's that fast feedback loop.
Yeah, I mean, sharing and just like, for example, photos and everything, just being transparent within the industry or within the company, I think really helps everybody in the whole team kind of bond together. So talking about remote teams, we always hear that, the way that we work and the way of work is changing. Do you think remote working is one of those changes, or what do you see for the future of work or how work currently is changing?
One theme that we're really seeing is just flexibility. And so whether that's, and technology really has driven that, because all, depending on your business, but a lot of the time you really just need a laptop now. And so to do the things like Slack and Skype and Trello. And so what we've seen in Victoria in the last 3 years, there's been a huge amount of growth in the co-working space. So we've got about 200. So Spacely has over 2,000 listings in Australia now for flexible workspace.
Wow.
And yeah, so Spacely is the marketplace for flexible work. So realestate.com does everything sort of in the real estate space that's buying and leasing and selling property. But what Spacely specializes in is short term, so anything under 12 months, and it's all about that flexibility, so that as you're expanding and contracting a team, you might decide you're starting a business, so you jump into a co-working space. It's a fintech company, and you think, right, I need to go hang out in a fintech co-working space. So there's two of you, and then as you grow and get traction with the business and you get more employees, you can expand and contract without having these huge overheads. So when I wouldn't recommend people start a manufacturing startup like I did, but I had to go and start a factory, right? And so I had to immediately sign a 5-year lease at a minimum. And so what I was doing was very sort of binary in its form, and it was much bigger than what I needed at the time. But I needed to, very quickly calculate how big my business was going to be in 12 months and 2 years. Where now it's completely different, particularly with tech companies, and so. You're able to expand and contract as required, and we've had huge growth in Australia in response to that. And it sort of makes sense. You've got your accounting software that expands and contracts as you require, and it's that sort of efficiency. And by catering to that, we're able to be more efficient. But you're then there's something magic that happens in these co-working spaces or shared space, and it comes back to I really do believe the future of innovation is collaboration rather than what is it, Peter Thiel's sort of 0 to 1 in innovation. That will happen, but there's this collaboration that I feel like is what happens before you make that huge jump, and it's hard to have these big ideas in complete isolation.
Yeah.
And so I found we worked out of a couple of co-working spaces in Japan and in Taiwan, but they were sort of more shared offices. When I have a look at what they've got now, though, it's ridiculous. And WeWork's in all of those countries now. We found it really interesting. So we've launched our marketplace in Australia, and we went on the premise that we're going after businesses that need flexibility. What we've found since is that, yes, there's that market, but then there's this market where you've got large corporates and they have flexible work policies now. And so you'll find that they might want to work for a day a week at home. And this all comes down to having really catering to, say, female leaders, and they want to pick up the kids from school a couple of days a week, and they're juggling with their partner, with who's going to sort of do the family jobs of that day. And so we've found that market really, really interesting. And in fact, I've got a meeting with the Australian government next week about having our platform available to their staff so that they can say, here are all the co-working spaces in Australia, regardless of where you are. go and work from there for a day. And that's very progressive thinking for a government. So it's almost like there are two really big markets there. There are the corporates that have got these big buildings, but you're having to commute. And I mean, some people will spend 2 hours on the train getting into the Melbourne CBD, and that's a long time. And if we look at the happiness scale and the efficiency scale, we're probably not doing that well there. So so that's a really interesting sort of watch this space to see how that changes, and whether we do a 50-50 split, where you're in town and you've got your meeting days, but then it's amazing how much work you do get done when you're working by yourself as well.
Yeah, that's very true. It's so interesting as well that big corporations, because typically when you go to these co-working spaces, it is a lot of entrepreneurs or, like people who are working for startups. You don't necessarily get a lot of big commercial company employees sitting next to you on their computers. But it'd be really interesting to have, a more diverse group that does have a lot of, because in the end, these co-working spaces are cool because, like you said, it's a community that you can pull from. People tend to be very friendly. Everyone's working, but at the same time, like grab a coffee or something and strike up a conversation. And you never know where that randomness or luck can play into different ideas.
Something I was doing regularly at Startup Victoria is actually making those introductions for startups into large corporates, because they might want to sell something into and really scale whatever their product and service was. And so I highly recommend it, regardless of whether you think you're doing something innovative. A lot of the time it is of interest, and there are collaboration opportunities to work with startups. And so this is a topic that I've been really doing a lot of thinking around, is corporate venturing and how it works. And so do you do it within the organisation yourself, which REA is very good at, or do you go and sort of leave a startup by itself, and you might invest in it or buy it out completely, or just purely collaborate with it. And that way you can leave your sort of corporate environment the way it is, without disrupting it, and then have these high growth ventures that operate in a very separate way. And so the opportunity to work in the same space is a great way to start that conversation and to learn from it.
Well, I guess that's what makes Spacely such an interesting company to work for, because it is very much kind of sounds like it's a startup attitude, but it does have like a huge corporation kind of backing and support that you can pull resources on.
Well, exactly. And so at the end, like, rather than say previously I was going out and raising venture capital, and that ended up being a big part of my job as founder. And a lot of the time it does take up a significant amount of energy, and sometimes it can be distracting. And so we're here, we've got a set amount that's being invested into the company, and the person that I'm raising, the capital through is the CEO, who's right behind me in the next desk, actually. And so, it's a very different environment. It's a lot more stable. But the same principles apply in terms of problem solving and going into new areas.
So just touching on you as a leader some more, and as you as an entrepreneur, I'm curious to know what you would say your largest challenges were that you've had to face, or obstacles you've had to overcome, both as a leader, whether it's an entrepreneur or working for Startup Victoria.
Yeah, the biggest one was probably my understanding myself. And so on a health level, I really didn't understand what was too much work. And so I ended up really running myself down. And you hear this from a lot of entrepreneurs, and they usually learn the hard way, which was generally how I learned, which I wish would change soon. But you work out, because you're just so focused on your business, you work out the hard way that you are the biggest asset in the business. If the founder isn't driving the business on a vision level. There's the operations that are day to day, but there's the vision which the founder or the CEO really holds. And you can't do that if you're not healthy and you're not getting the right amount of sleep and exercise and all it's really basic stuff. But when you're running a business, you can get completely overwhelmed with what you need to do, that you end up working very hard. But working hard doesn't necessarily get outcomes on the business. Sometimes it's better to get a good night's sleep and come in with a fresh mind, and you can actually think about something differently and just solve it, in a really efficient way, rather than doing the hard slog. And that then goes into your leadership style as well. So rather than being really harsh, you can actually do things in a gentle way with your staff. And so that's something that when you read business books, it's all about this sort of like really hard and fast. It's a very masculine way of running a business. And a lot of the time they're written by men. And so on the other side, there's a female perspective, and this is just mine, I can't speak for all females, but I've really focused on bringing a more gentle environment for my staff to be happy, call things out and feel comfortable calling things out that needed to change, rather than have sort of this harsh sort of tough sort of attitude, I guess. And so that slight change of attitude can change the way your staff work and then output of the business. And so I had lots of women on my production line actually, because of their attention to detail, and so it was really important that their kids were happy, and so we would make sure that stuff was spoken about at work as well. Because if there's stuff going on at home, it's not that it has to be left at home, because it makes it more stressful at work. It's something that, feeding back into flexibility, that if they did need to attend something at home, then that's just as important to me as it is to them, because it's about sort of this holistic view of the company and looking at that. It's almost a triple bottom line, really, of the company, and your biggest asset is the people within it.
So there's a couple of things that you just said that I wanted to touch on. First, I'm curious to know, so obviously you're saying that, as a founder or as a leader, you really had to take care of yourself, and it took you a while to figure that out, as I think it does most founders and entrepreneurs. So now that you have your wisdom, how do you find your balance, or what do you do to make sure that you stay fresh and are able to bring innovation to your teams?
I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease a couple of years into my business. And so, regardless of what the diagnosis is, your entrepreneurs are very good at making themselves sick. Regardless if they've got sort of a predisposition to something, whether it's through stress. And so for me, I keep an eye on what I'm putting into my body, my exercise and my free time in my brain, and making sure that I'm not sort of in my downtime. It's actual downtime. I'm not looping crap in my head that I shouldn't be thinking about. It's actually been really, really diligent. And I needed to spend a lot of time meditating and doing some like overcompensating. And now I've got a really good read on how I'm feeling. So understanding, am I stressed or anxious, or am I relaxed? And so I find the more relaxed I am going into situations that might be challenging, the better I am to cope. And I guess the difference between working in a big company that might be slower moving versus a startup is you basically need to come in every day with the gloves on, ready to tackle whatever the challenges the day is going to throw you. And usually they're disasters. So, you've got a lot of, for my, in my situation, I needed to get wine out the door in order to get it into certain countries, in order to get money in the bank account. And so it was critical that the production line was running efficiently. And so there'd be problems on that all the time, and problems from the wine industry, problems in farming, whether there was enough rain and how that affected the business. And so you're constantly I guess that the problems that you get as an entrepreneur and how you react to those is what defines you as a leader. And so there's no, as I said before, there's no sort of theory and rule book for this. But how you react to the problems is what defines you, and you can't expect to react in your best way if you are tired and or stressed or whatever it might be. So it's just sort of it's working in a really smart way rather than a hard way.
Yeah, that's very good advice. So just a couple questions before we finish off, but I just wanted, so you mentioned that, you as a leader try to take a more gentle approach. What are some tips that you personally have found useful in order to become a successful leader that you would like to give to everybody else?
I think it's important to work out what your secret weapon is as a founder. Really work out what you're good at, and to work out what you're good at, for me, it was work out what you like doing, because then it'll be a lot easier. So there'll be parts of the business that you love, and then there will be parts of the business that you don't really. And ideally, you employ for those bits that you don't like. So for me, I don't have an attention to detail, and I don't particularly want one because I'm really good at the vision stuff and the big problems, but the small ones, I find I get sort of bogged down with. And so I will be able to oversee a lot of the admin and the things that are going on in the back end of the business, but I don't necessarily want to be doing those day to day. And so that's something that work out what your secret weapon is as a founder, and really make sure you surround yourself in an environment that makes the most of that. And I guess as we were saying before, there's lots of business books out there. There's lots of self-help books, but you are the greatest asset in this business. And so whether you're about to start the business or it's something that's you've already got up and running, really calling out why you are the best person to run this company is a really important one, because it's something you can call out to yourself as well, as being the linchpin.
So
Yes.
You were talking about, different leadership books that you've been reading. Are there any books or resources that you would recommend people to read in order to to learn more about entrepreneurship or how to be a good leader? Anything that you found really useful or motivating?
A book that I've revisited recently, I've just given my team, is The Lean Startup by Eric Ries. It's super simple, but those principles you'll find intertwined in lots of other theory. But that structure of learning, which feeds into building and then to measure, and you basically do that on a daily basis, is a really it's a really important one when you're going into new spaces and you want to work out whether what you're doing is actually going down the right path. So I feel like that's a bit of a startup Bible. And then leadership's a hard one, because it really depends on the person. There's a personality and there's a human, and you want them to be reacting, or sort of, the more they can do from their heart rather than their head, the better. So there's lots of books which can be very noisy up in your head, but there's a gut instinct with leaders that's usually pretty interesting and pretty sort of smack on point as well. So the more I've learned to really listen to myself and my own instincts in a situation, the better it has been. And so that does take time, and it might even take coaching. I certainly do a lot of coaching, as in I get a lot of coaching in that space, because that's the human element that you're bringing into business. And the more you can refine that and listen to that, the better.
Awesome. Definitely trusting oneself is definitely very important, especially as a founder and entrepreneur. as a leader, but it can also be very daunting as well. Okay, so Georgia, last question that we have for you. What's one piece of advice that you would like to give to everyone today?
One piece of advice is working out what your unique secret weapon is as a founder, and really calling that out, because that's going to be a fundamental theme in your business and how it executes in its go-to-market strategies right the way through to culture. And that's the human element behind the founder that really does get you want it to be translated into the company. So working out what that is early is a fantastic thing, and it's a very easy way to communicate to your potential employees as well what the environment's going to be like working with you. So the secret weapon as a founder is a critical one.
Awesome. So everybody should know what their secret weapon and their secret sauce is.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Georgia, for joining us today. If anybody wanted to reach out and contact you, what would be the best way for them to do that?
Best way, I am on Twitter, which is G Beattie, otherwise, as in @GBeattie. Otherwise, LinkedIn's always a good one. They're my two main platforms, and yeah, love to hear from anyone.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again so much for joining us, and thank you everyone for joining us today on the session of Inspire. Until next time, be inspired.